You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I am joined today by Jimmy McGee and Rebecca Wheeler-Walston. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Rebecca, you've been on the podcast before in episode 104, when you graciously read one of your stories. But Jimmy, you're not only new to the podcast, like you're new to me. We just met each other. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, what you spend your time doing?
I read often. I just finished a very encouraging and wonderful new biography on Martin Luther King. It's called King of Life. I am the president and CEO of the Impact Movement. This is a national campus ministry that serves Black students around the country. And I want to emphasize Black. Most times people don't hear Black and they interchange the word African American. That's not true. We want to serve students of the diaspora. So we have Africans, we have Caribbeans, we have African Americans. And I'm really trying my darndest to see if we can explore how to really reach Afro-Latinos. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. Prior to my stint with Impact, I've been with Impact for 8 years, closing in at the end of 8 years. I was in campus ministry with another campus ministry before that.
Okay, thank you. So the two of you have come on the podcast today to talk about story work and to invite folks to an upcoming event that will allow participants to engage their own stories in more depth. But before we get to talking about the event that you guys are doing, let's just start by talking about like how Impact Movement, the ministry that you both are associated with, like as a ministry, how did you all begin to delve into the realm of story work, and why? Because this is a relatively new endeavor for Impact. So, Jimmy, can you talk some about why story work has become important in your ministry?
Yeah, it actually started on a whim from a woman who is now our board member, but she was actually an employee of the Allender Center. She arranged for me to come and be a part of the story workshop that is sponsored by the Allender Center, August of 2016. And I flew from where I was in the country to Seattle. And I was in the room there. The imagination for the experience was not for me just to go through the story workshop, but also for me to engage Dan Allender, Becky, and some other facilitators. And as I listened and processed that moment, I began to see, wow, this trauma thing really is another way for us to expand our work with students, because a number of our students were experiencing trauma. Now, at that time, the trauma that we were experiencing that's become very common is just every other month there was a public death of a Black person in the market square. And after talking to Dan and engaging him at least 2 or 3 occasions, we began to unfold a relationship between the Allender Center and the Impact Movement. You can't really help facilitate trauma in someone else's life if you haven't or started to begin to engage the trauma in your own life. And so at one point, maybe in the first or second year of the pandemic, we had 98% of all of the staff in Impact go through the story workshop, so that they began to understand and became familiar with some of the terms and language. And then we had other staff like Rebecca who started getting trained in facilitating trauma care.
Rebecca, I want to hear a little bit from you because you've engaged your story in depth. You facilitate story engagements, groups where others are engaging their stories. Can you share a little bit, just personally, how has engaging your story led to good things in your world, Rebecca, led to transformation? And how is story work different than more traditional modes of discipleship?
When I was a student in college, I was involved in the Impact Movement heavily. And I had an opportunity to go on a summer project with Campus Crusade. And there was a woman there, a staff woman, who gave her personal testimony. And her testimony included a childhood of sexual abuse and trauma. And she had in her hand a copy of Dan Allender's book, The Wounded Heart. By the time she finished her testimony, I was on the floor in a puddle of tears because there's a lot of what she said that mirrored my own story. And I approached her at the conclusion of her talk, and it started a conversation amongst us for the rest of the summer. And she put a copy of The Wounded Heart in my hand. And as a student in a college campus ministry, there's a lot of conversation and talk about sexual purity, about abstinence, about, you know, wise decisions in your dating life and how that connects to your theology and how that connects to your sense of walking with God. And to be honest, as a college student, I was struggling and really putting two and two together with her talk, Dan's book, and my personal life. I realized, oh, I need more than what my college campus ministry was able to give me, which was, can we pray? Can you memorize some scripture? Can I give you an accountability partner? All those things were good, but they weren't good enough. Fast forward, 20 plus years later, and I find myself listening to Jimmy talk about his experience at the Story Workshop and his thought that we need to bring this into what we do so we can have, if you will, a trauma-informed sort of sense of discipleship, right? And so story work has really invited me into what's the reason why at 20-something, at 30-something, at 40-something, I find myself struggling with a solid, healthy relationship. What's the reason why my behavior does not match the scripture that I hold so dear to my heart? And I found that story work is very helpful to me personally in terms of understanding my why so that I can change my how.
So anytime we talk about story work, we're talking about how the past is still influencing the present, whether we talk about individual trauma and individual stories in our family of origin, whether we talk about collective trauma, racial trauma, we are always talking about how past experiences in this world are playing out in the present. So Jimmy, you obviously have incorporated a trauma focus into Impact over the course of your tenure. Maybe that's been a shift, but say a little bit about why is it important for you as the head of the Impact movement for your staff to understand trauma?
You know, one of the things that's pretty important in this conversation as you introduce the idea of collective trauma is that a lot of this is theological dissonance for a lot of people. Western form of Christianity has been overrun or syncretized to individualism. The idea that I stand on my own, why you can't see me as an individual, why am I a part of this, is certainly true for the white community, but it's also true for the black community, as a lot of black people want to see separate from the black community. They want to see the individual. None of this is true in the scriptures. The other thing that people are not aware of is that of process, of what the process is. So what I've learned over these last 6 to 7 years is, one, that this is a reality that we're living in the context of this country. So we're talking about complex trauma, not just collective trauma. So complex trauma is the trauma experiences we experience individually. Collective trauma is associated with our historical realities of being a part of our ethnic group that we need to unpack. And that's true both oppressed or oppressor. See, because what we never talk about, or we don't talk about it enough, depending on your circles, is that both the oppressed and the oppressors are both traumatized, and they're both victims of trauma. And both of them are trying to repress this memory. And that means for both of us to find whole, it's not something that we find just individually within our group or individually within our personhood. It's something that has to be found among us, cross-pollinated. Something that we need this as a part of our expression of witness in this Christian world. That's why I think it's important for our students. And then here's the other part that we don't deal with, the whole idea of how evil is present in this world. And we don't do a good job in today's Christian experience to engage that as a form of the orientation or the origin of trauma. And so all this is important for our students.
Now, the flip side of trauma is resilience. And Rebecca, yesterday, when you and I were talking, you said each people group has innate capacities for navigating trauma, from healing from trauma. How is that true for African Americans? In what ways? Or more broadly, for Black folks? What do you mean by innate capacities and resilience, Rebecca?
So I'm going to start a little bit from personal and then move to the collective. So when I first came to like my own story and my own trauma, and mine is chronic, it started in the womb. My sense of myself in the world has always been, I've never known a place that was not traumatic. When I came to faith, I looked at God as if he was an EMT, like an ambulance driver who showed up after the accident, after the trauma, and went about the business of triaging everybody. And then you get your sort of bandaged up and, he kind of sets you back on your feet and pushes you back out into the world to face everything again. And as I started to do work in my own story, people began to challenge that notion of when, where, and how is it that God shows up. I began to start to identify in my own personality wiring this sort of sense of like the ability to withstand something that is difficult and that really should have overtaken and overwhelmed me. And yet I'm still standing. And I have no other explanation, even in my own story, it being exposed to acute trauma in utero. I shouldn't be here. By all accounts, by all medical wisdom and knowledge, I shouldn't be breathing. And I have no other explanation for that other than a sovereign God who says, I knit you together in your mother's womb. What does that mean? What exactly are you knitting in there? And is it possible that in the knitting together of my personhood, that God himself knit into my very constitution a capacity to hold out hope for better, for more, for stronger? I believe that this sense of the process of knitting together in the womb is not just putting cells together, not just stitching DNA together, but actually stitching something into your into your way of thinking and being and moving in the world. There's something there that allows me to engage the story that I would have, the obstacles I would be asked to overcome, the struggles I would be asked to face. There's something there from the very beginning. If I were to extrapolate that out to an entire people group, I'm identified in U.S. law as African-American. And really, when you think about that hyphenated existence, we are a people group that exists only because of the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade. Mm-hmm. But for that, we don't actually exist. This notion of a trauma that hit an entire community with such force that it obliterated the fabric of an entire people and then knitted something new and different in its place. As a people group, we have a sense of before the trauma and after the trauma. There's a book called Born on the Water that came out of the 1619 Project. And one of the ideas, even by the very title, is this notion that we, African Americans, are a people that was created in the water of the transatlantic slave trade. We entered the ship on African shores one way, and by the time we arrive on U.S. soil, we are a different people group. Something happened on that water that forged a new identity. And so my sense of if God can knit together in my mother's womb pieces of himself into me that give me the capacity to be resilient in the face of unspeakable harm, what then happens in the face of our trauma as African Americans? What happened on that water? And what is it that God stitched into us as a people that gave us what we needed to still be standing here 400 years post transatlantic slave trade?
So as I listen to this story, I think it's important to realize that the experience of our trauma and our resilience and hope is not just for us, it's for others. You know, I just told you, I just finished reading King of Life, and just the profound theological commitment that King had for the redemption of white people, that he was against hate, he was for love. But the book I'm reading now is really profound. It's by Reggie Williams, and it's called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. And it talks about how Bonhoeffer, who came here after World War I as a German and was on a year at the Sloan Fellowship at Union Seminary in New York City. And the profundity of this whole thing is that he was on his way of his Lutheran theology of really affirming the theology that brought in the hate for Jews. But being in Harlem and then going and joining Abyssinian Baptist Church, building friends with a black pastor, and then engaging the Harlem Renaissance, he engaged an alternative Jesus, a different Jesus than the dominant colonial Jesus that not only permitted him to see trauma and the resilience and how they had a profound faith that was liberating in Jesus, it also trained him and actually convicted him to go back to Germany to stand against Nazism. And his idea to bring redemption to stop the murder of Jews. The same thing that Rebecca's talking about now is the same thing that caught Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who so many white evangelicals, they talk about him, the cost of discipleship, not realizing of how influential Du Bois and all these other African American thought leaders were from the Renaissance to changing this man's life. So it's the idea of saying what was good for us wasn't just for us. It was for God's kingdom, and it's being borrowed into the lives of other communities.
Those are some profound words from both of you. I want to transition, if we can, to talk a little bit about this event that's coming up called Hope and Anchor Story Weekend that the Impact Movement's putting on. Jimmy, can you just explain, just give us the nuts and bolts, the details, what this event is and how our listeners can participate if they want to?
You know, the dream, the imagination for us in the Impact Movement, and it's the reality that mental health is not something that people of color do. Right? We're taught to, baby, just press that in. You got to move on. Now, I'm going to play with some of my thoughts about trauma 4 years ago and now. So my idea was that black folk just didn't talk about trauma. Or is that true even for Asian and Latino communities and Native? We didn't talk about the trauma, but it manifested itself in hypertension, in sugar diabetes, in cancer, in our death. Now, 4 years later, though, there's a resilience that I see back in them older folk. When they say, baby, we got to press this on, that resilience did not stop. And that meant they could press on. All of us have something hurting, whether it's Asian, Latino, Native, or Black. All of us got something hurting, but we got to press through this. And that's what Hope and Anchor is. The anchor is the realization that we can press through this. So it's our hope that we would do something that is multi-ethnic, inviting Black, Native, Asian, Latino, and white in the room. That we're going to deal with this complex collective trauma. Because we realize some people are bringing in some of their individual trauma that they experience, like what Rebecca said, from birth. But then also some people are really bringing in this trauma that last week we got one more thing against us with the Supreme Court throwing down another part of affirmative action which people don't really understand the historic trauma, what that unleashes. And they just think, oh no, it's a fair world we live in. We don't need these things. And no one's even looking at the statistics. That's what Hope and Anchor is supposed to do. It's complex, it's collective, but it's also multi-ethnic. So there'll be white people in the room, Black, Latino, Asian, and Native in the room for us to do the individual work to talk about Story Workshop, but also listen to the collective work as we do this as well. And this is going to be September 29th through October 1st.
And this event, it's going to be via Zoom. So it doesn't matter where you are, you can participate. September 29 to October 1. If people want to sign up or you want to read more about it, the website is hopeandanchor.us. You can go there to find out more about it. The cost is $599 for this event. And if you participate in it, everyone's going to be in a group where they have the opportunity to share a story of harm from their life, either past or more recent. And that group is going to be led by a trained facilitator. Yes, Jimmy?
Yes.
Okay. And it's important to note that this event is it's not only open to white folks. Here's how you put it on the brochure. You want white people who are open to a nuanced conversation around racial trauma. So let's look at that phrase for a minute. First of all, Jimmy, why are you lead a ministry that is focused primarily on Black folk. Why are you opening up this event to white folks?
Well, I think there's two reasons. I think it's C.T. Vivian, one of my early mentors. He was a lieutenant of Dr. King. And I can still remember him saying these words to me privately and publicly. And he says, white people need Black people to save their souls. And I would argue that some of the spaces where oppression reoccurs, trauma reoccurs, are places that white people live that we're not present in. And we need them to not only understand the trauma, but to advocate in those spaces. Now, the one thing you said about nuance that I will say, if this is the first space that you want to begin to understand race in the United States of America, this is not the place you need to show up. However, if you've been working at this, and I mean working, not just understanding and saw a couple of videos, but building relationships, and you're concerned about this dilemma, you are very engaged, and you saw what happened to George Floyd. You know what's happened to Ahmaud Arbery. You know what happened to a variety of people in this work, and you want to say, how do I deepen this to help white people understand trauma, and then how I can become and build empathy with other people of color? This is a space for you. We want to ruin white people's lives so that in the places that they exist, that they take for granted their privilege, that they would advocate with the memory of me, even though I'm not in the room.
Rebecca, anything you want to add to what you mean by open to a nuanced conversation around racial trauma?
When we get into a conversation about race in this country, we tend to fall into some very familiar rubrics, some sort of camps, if you will, that can keep us locked into certain narratives around race. We can really go to our own corners and only come out swinging. And then people tend to feel defensive, right? If you're a white person, the sense of feeling attacked, feeling like you're being attacked for something that you didn't personally participate in. If you're a person of color, right, you can come to this work and get caught in these very familiar narratives that really keep us from being able to hear each other, understand each other, and then actually engage together in the collective work of learning to be in proximity to each other in a way that is honoring to who God made each of us and the collective sort of people groups that we belong to.
Yeah, and one of the things I think we all just need to get candid about is that God seems to be profoundly interested in differentness and diversity, because we live in a world of immense difference. And I want to go back, Jimmy, to something you said earlier. I won't get the quote exactly right, but when you were talking, it was about how for us white folks, there is a sense in which our liberation is bound up in the liberation of others. And the quote, the famous quote, I think it's Lilla Watson said that if you've come to help us, she was an Australian Aboriginal woman. If you've come to help us, she's speaking to those that are coming in to help the Aboriginal people in Australia. If you've come to help us, she says, you're wasting your time. But if you believe that your liberation is bound up with ours, then let us work together. And this is why, as a white person, I am interested in an event like this, because I believe that my liberation, my freedom, my maturity, my healing is bound up in the liberation of all peoples. Jimmy, you want to say something to that? Respond to that?
Yeah, I want to say, again, you're speaking theological dissonance in today's Christian world. See, today's Christian world is about my individual relationship with God. But the realization, and this is throughout the thread of scripture that unfortunately does not come up, this whole idea of shalom. Shalom means that my well-being is at risk if you don't have it, Adam. And I can't have full shalom apart from you having it. And that I should not be at peace when you're not at peace. But that's not the theology that we teach.
Rebecca, you wanted to ask me a question before we end. Do you want to ask it now?
Yeah, Adam, you've been sitting on screen for the last hour plus with these two Black people, and you are white and male. And so I'm curious, right, how does this event land for you? How does it land that it is hosted by a Black ministry? How does it land for you, the conversation around racial trauma? Is it something that you would feel interested in? Where do you feel dissonance, hesitation?
I don't know how to say this strongly enough. The generosity that I would be invited into an event like this, given the state of our world and the history of our country, generous is not a strong enough word. So I don't have a category to understand why, as a white person, I am invited at times, and clearly this is one of those times, by people of color into conversation when so many of those conversations have been rooted in a defensiveness and a distrust and a dismissal of your ouch. We can just put it that simply. You saying, ouch. When I was in Atlanta, when I lived in Atlanta, I heard a man named Michael Eric Dyson speak at my seminary. And Michael Eric Dyson, I've read so much of what he's wrote because he really moved me. And he basically said this. He said, I'll just quote him. He said, he's speaking to white folks. He's like, we are forced to be gentle with you, which is another way of saying we are forced to lie to you. Your feelings get hurt when we tell you that you're white and that your whiteness makes a difference in how you're treated. Now, that's a very important couple of sentences for me. Michael Eric Dyson is saying, and he's not the only person that said this, he just has a public platform. He's saying, look, I'm white. I, Adam Young, am white. That doesn't make me an inherently bad person. It does mean that I have a culture, and that culture is whiteness. And how is it that my bodily chemistry starts to get affected when that's talked about in mixed racial company? Like, what's going on there? Because there's something happening in my body when I'm at a table with Black folk or other people of color and race becomes a topic. My nervous system changes. I know that. I also know I'm not the only white person whose nervous system changes when race is brought up. And what Michael Dyson is saying, and he's right, is that on the whole, people of color are forced to be gentle with us white folks when they say, you're white. and your whiteness affects how you experience life in this country.
That's right. Which means that we're going to need people to be courageous. Go ahead, Rebecca. Excuse me.
Right. I mean, I just think even this little few minutes is really what we are meaning by the sense of a nuanced conversation. What has to be true in the room, individually and collectively, for Adam, for you to be able to say, you got a point there, right? Like, my nervous system is affected whenever race is a topic. And I can be honest about that, and I can have some curiosity about why that's true. And that I'm open to stepping into a conversation with people who do not look like me to explore what that is about. And if I'm honest, every Black person I know can say the same thing. Our nervous system is equally affected when there are white folks in the room, whether race is a topic or not. And so, can we have a conversation about that? And is it safe enough for us to have that conversation together with Adam in the room, Jimmy in the room, Rebecca in the room, and other people groups? Is there enough space for us to start to have that conversation with some level of integrity, right? And that's our hope for this work in the impact movement, is that this event is about creating a space that is not safe, period, but safe enough to say things like what you just said. And there's enough capacity in the room for us to be able to hold the truth of those statements and what they say about you, Adam, as a white man, what they say about me, Rebecca, as a Black woman, what they say about Jimmy as a Black man, and what they say about our collective people group and our collective people groups in proximity to one another. And I don't know how we have that conversation without being anchored in the power of Jesus Christ. Because it is going to take something supernatural, something beyond our own human capacity and ability to actually have that conversation with a kind of integrity and humanity that Scripture demands of us. And that is the reason why we come to this work out of a faith tradition than just merely like sociological. Like I need more than that to be able to hold that conversation that we're having and not lose it completely.
Rebecca, Jimmy, thank you for your time today. Thank you for coming on the podcast. If you listeners are interested in participating in this event, it's limited to about 35 spots. So check out hopeandanchor.us. All the registration info is there. Jimmy, Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you, Adam, for your generosity in entertaining this conversation. And, Lord willing, this will be the first of many. We'll get to do some work together.